The fluorescent lights of the trauma center at St. Jude's Memorial hummed with a high-pitched frequency that most people were too busy to hear. But for Zola, that sound was a constant, drilling reminder of the artificial world she now inhabited. At 27, with skin the color of deep mahogany and a stillness that unnerved the casual observer, she moved through the sterile corridors like a ghost. She wore standard-issue blue scrubs, a uniform that rendered her invisible to the high-status residents who strutted through the halls. To them, she was just part of the furniture, a pair of hands to mop up a spill or hold a retractor. They assumed she was someone who had likely scraped by in community college and was simply lucky to be allowed inside the city's most prestigious private hospital. They didn't notice the way her eyes constantly scanned the exits or how she instinctively checked the structural density of the walls whenever she entered a room. They only saw the slight, rhythmic tremor in her left hand and labeled it as nervousness. It wasn't nervousness. It was a residual echo of a high-velocity impact from a life she had buried under 3 layers of redacted government files. Dr. Sterling, the chief attending, was a primary architect of her daily humiliation. A man sculpted by family money and Ivy League rowing teams. He possessed an ego that consumed all the oxygen in the room. He leaned against the nurse's station, twirling a gold-plated pen as Zola walked by with a tray of sterilized instruments. "Careful with that tray, Zola," he drawled, his voice projecting for his gaggle of sycophantic residents. "Try not to let the sheiks drop a $10,000 set of forceps. We don't have the budget for clumsy mistakes." Zola didn't flinch as the residents snickered. Her face remained a mask of absolute neutrality. In her mind, she was calculating the exact distance between Sterling's carotid artery and the pen in his hand, a reflex she couldn't turn off. But outwardly, she was just a quiet, trembling nurse who knew her place. The transition from operative to civilian was a jagged, ill-fitting suit that Zola Nairi Whitman wore every day. As she pushed the heavy steel cart toward the surgical wing, her mind was a split-screen display. On one side, she was a junior trauma nurse ensuring the integrity of a $10,000 surgical tray. On the other, she was an asset evaluating the kill zone potential of every corridor she crossed. She stepped into the main atrium, her eyes performing a rhythmic, practiced sweep that the hospital staff mistook for the daydreaming of a low-ranking employee. She didn't just see a high-traffic lobby. She saw a primary breach point with 3 blind spots and a lack of reinforced cover. Her gaze lingered for a microsecond on the massive decorative pillars. To a patient, they were marble-clad beauty. To Zola, they were structural anchors, dense enough to stop a 7.62 millimeters round. Her boots made no sound on the linoleum, a habit born of years moving through environments where noise was a death sentence. As she passed through the heavy sliding doors of the ICU, she instinctively checked the structural density of the frame, noting the hydraulic pressure required to force them if the power went out. This was the engine idling. The predatory reflex she couldn't turn off, no matter how many layers of redacted government files she buried her past under. Her hand twitched in her pocket, the rhythmic tremor vibrating against her thigh. It wasn't a sign of a breaking mind, but the residual echo of a high-velocity impact, a physical memory of a mission that officially never happened. She tightened her grip on the tray, the cold steel of the instruments grounding her. In the distance, Dr. Sterling's voice echoed to the ward, loud, arrogant, and dangerously unaware. Zola watched him from periphery, her internal HUD heads-up display, automatically identifying his vulnerabilities. He was the kind of man who had never known a world where the hum of the lights meant something was about to break. She retreated to the far corner of the nurse's station, placing her back against a reinforced concrete wall. Never a door, never glass. She opened her locker to find her small, weathered notebook. Inside were no grocery lists or shift schedules. Instead, there were hand-drawn diagrams of the hospital's ventilation shafts and the precise timing of the security patrols. To the world, Zola was a statue, a creepy girl who scraped by in community college. But as she closed her locker, her eyes caught a reflection in the polished metal. The mask of neutrality was perfect, but behind it, the operative was simply biding her time. She was a dormant weapon in a room full of people who mistook her silence for weakness, waiting for the one frequency that would signal her return to the ward she had tried to leave behind. The break room was a suffocating box of stale coffee and passive aggression, a place Zola usually avoided, but hospital protocol demanded she take her 15-minute rest. She sat in the far corner, her back pressed against a reinforced concrete wall. Never the door, never the glass. To the casual observer, she was nursing a bottle of water in a state of vacant exhaustion. In reality, she was monitoring the acoustic footprint of the hallway through the thin drywall, her mind mapping the footsteps of every resident passing by. The other nurses, a clique led by a sharp-tongued woman named Brenda, were clustered around a smartphone at the center table. Their laughter was loud, performative, and jagged. Occasionally, their eyes would dart toward the corner, their whispers intended to carry across the linoleum like slow-acting poison. They mocked Zola's silence, her total lack of social engagement, and the way she refused to participate in the toxic gossip that fueled the night shift. "She's like a statue," Brenda whispered, rolling her eyes as she leaned toward the group. I asked her how her weekend was, and she just said, "Quiet." Who even talks like that? It's creepy. A younger nurse giggled, glancing at Zola's hands. Sterling says she probably washed out of some terrifying militant boarding school because she couldn't handle the pressure. Look at her. She's probably vibrating inside right now. They laughed again, finding a twisted comfort in their shared cruelty, unaware that the woman they were mocking was currently identifying the most efficient way to neutralize every person in the room, using only the plastic cutlery on the table. Zola stared at the water in her bottle, watching the liquid settle into a perfect, undisturbed plane. She wasn't offended. Offense required valuing their opinion. She was simply biding her time, an engine idling in the dark, waiting for the shift to end so she could return to the solitude of her apartment where the noise of the world couldn't reach her. Zola took a slow, measured sip of water, her face a mask of absolute neutrality. To Brenda and the others, she was a new nurse who was lucky to be there, a girl who didn't have the social grace to fit in. They didn't see the scars beneath her scrubs or the way she never blinked when the break room door slammed shut. She remained a statue, a silent ghost in a room full of people who mistook her discipline for a defect. As the mockery continued, she merely checked the time. 7 minutes remained of her mandated dormancy. She adjusted her grip on the bottle, her rhythmic tremor hidden beneath the table, perfectly still and utterly ready for a call that had not yet come. The silence of the break room was shattered by the harsh, rhythmic blare of the red phone. It was a sound that didn't just ring. It demanded, cutting through the thick atmosphere of stale coffee and petty mockery like a serrated blade. The direct line to emergency dispatch was reserved for the kind of chaos that hospitals prayed would bypass their doors, catastrophic cases where seconds were measured in blood loss. The atmosphere shifted instantly from passive aggression to a high-voltage panic. Brenda dropped her phone, the screen clattering against the table as the laughter died in her throat. The other nurses looked at each other with wide, fearful eyes, their social hierarchies dissolving in the face of a genuine crisis. Then the intercom crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice sounding breathless and strained through the speakers. Code Black. Multiple GSWs. High-value target incoming. ETA 2 minutes. Private security only. Police escort is negative. The words Code Black sent a jolt of adrenaline through the department. It was the hospital's version of a storm warning, signaling unchecked violence, a patient of dangerous necessity, and the potential for a threat to the facility itself. For the staff, it was a nightmare of gangland fallout. For Zola, it was a signal. Zola didn't rush. She didn't gasp, while the others remained frozen in a state of reactive shock. She simply stood up with a deliberate, haunting calm. She capped her water bottle and placed it on the table with a soft, final click. When she moved, her stride was suddenly different. No longer the shuffling gait of an invisible junior nurse, but something smoother, grounded, and predatory. As she stepped out of the break room, the hallway was already a theater of flailing authority. Dr. Sterling was shouting orders, his voice pitched an octave higher than usual as the smooth veneer of his Ivy League confidence cracked under the pressure. Get the trauma team. Prepare O negative. Tell security to lock down the lobby. He was waving his arms at a staff that was already moving, his leadership reduced to white noise interference. Zola passed him without a glance, her eyes locked on the double doors of the ambulance bay. Her mind was already shifting gears, shedding the skin of civilian dormancy and accelerating into operational readiness. She could hear the hum of the trauma center's lights again, but now it sounded like the countdown of a fuse. The invisible nurse was gone. In her place was a woman who understood exactly what was coming through those doors, and she was the only one in the building who wasn't afraid. The sliding glass doors of the ambulance bay didn't just open. They were nearly taken off their tracks as a phalanx of men in black suits surged into the trauma center. The clinical silence of St. Jude's was instantly replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots and the frantic, shouted commands of men who operated outside the law. At the center of the storm was Han Tae-jeon. He wasn't on a gurney. Supported by two massive enforcers, the Mafia Boss was a terrifying vision of wounded power. His bespoke white dress shirt, once a symbol of untouchable wealth, was soaked through a map of spreading crimson that pooled at his hip and stained the linoleum floor with every staggering step. Despite the pallor of his skin turning a sickly, hypoxic gray under the harsh fluorescent lights, his eyes remained sharp, burning with a lucid, predatory focus that kept the hospital security team frozen in the hallway. The sterile environment was instantly compromised. The air grew heavy with the smell of iron, expensive cologne, and the raw, radiating scent of aggressive fear. "Clear the room," one of the enforcers roared, his hand hovering near the shoulder, holster visible beneath his jacket. "No one touches him unless we say. No cops. No questions." Dr. Sterling and his team of residents were backed against the nurse's station, their white coats a stark contrast to the dark, violent energy now filling the bay. Sterling's jaw, usually set in a smirk of Ivy League superiority, was hanging slack. He looked at the blood, then at the guns, and finally at the man who looked like he had crawled out of a war zone to claim the hospital as his own. The symphony of controlled chaos that Sterling usually conducted had collapsed into a jagged dissonance he couldn't control. As the enforcers forced Tae-jeon onto a trauma bed, the hospital's privacy curtains were ripped shut, creating a makeshift fortress in the center of the room. The medical monitors began to wail, a high-pitched frantic beeping that mirrored the rising pulse of everyone in the room. The power dynamic had shifted with tectonic force. The hospital was no longer a place of healing, but a sanctuary under siege. From the periphery, Zola watched the invasion with a stillness that was almost unnatural. While the other nurses cowered and the doctor stammered, she clocked the tactical reality of the room in seconds. She saw the way the enforcers were checking for blind spots and the specific angle Han Tae-jeon held his body to protect his vitals. She recognized the serpent-like precision of their formation. To everyone else, this was an underworld invasion that signaled the end of their orderly world. To Zola, it was a homecoming. The engine in her chest, which had been idling for years in the dark, finally caught the spark. As Dr. Sterling took a hesitant, trembling step toward the bed only to be met with a cold barrel of a weapon, Zola stepped out from the shadows. She didn't look at the guns. She looked at the blood. She looked at the man who was dying like a king, and for the first time in 3 years, she knew exactly what to do. The air in the trauma bay had curdled, thick with the metallic scent of blood and the electric charge of impending violence. Dr. Sterling, usually the undisputed sovereign of this clinical domain, looked like a man who had suddenly realized he was standing on a landmine. His gold-plated pen, the scepter of his authority, lay forgotten on the floor, knocked away as the enforcers cleared the space. Faced with the raw, kinetic-threaded guns, the chief attending's Ivy League confidence didn't just crack. It shattered. The man who could casually dismantle Zola's dignity in front of an audience was now struggling to draw a full breath. His jaw worked soundlessly, his eyes darting frantically from the blood-soaked shirt of Han Tae-jeon to the cold, dark muzzles of the weapons pointed at his chest. I can't. We need to follow protocol," Sterling stammered, his voice rising into a thin, hysterical register that betrayed the complete collapse of his composure. He took a staggering step backward, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "This is a hospital. You can't have weapons here. I need to call the board. I need security to—" "Security is on the floor, and the board isn't going to stop him from bleeding out," one of the enforcers growled, stepping into Sterling's personal space. The barrel of a handgun pressed into the soft space beneath Sterling's chin, tilting his head back. "Fix him. Now. Sterling's face turned a translucent shade of white. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. Tracing a path through the expensive foundation, he wore to hide the signs of aging. He looked at the surgical trays Zola had brought in, the $10,000 instruments he had mocked her for holding, and his hand began to shake with a violent, uncontrollable palsy. It wasn't the rhythmic echo of Zola's hand. It was a pure, unadulterated tremor of a coward who had lived his entire life behind the safety of family money and professional titles. He reached for a pair of forceps, but his grip was so loose and his focus so fractured that the tool clattered onto the metal tray with a deafening ring. He was paralyzed. The elite was gone, replaced by a terrified man who couldn't remember the basic steps of a trauma assessment. The residents behind him fared no better, huddled together like frightened sheep, their sycophantic approval replaced by a desperate wish to be anywhere else. The heart monitor connected to Han to Jim began to flatline into a long, agonizing drone. The Mafia Boss's head rolled to the side, his eyes glazing over as his body finally succumbed to hypovolemic shock. The enforcer's fingers tightened on their triggers, the sound of safety catches clicking off echoing like thunder in the small room. Sterling let out a soft, whimpering sound, his knees buckling. He was useless. He was a conductor who had lost his baton and forgotten the music. In that moment of absolute collapse, the social hierarchy of St. Jude's was incinerated. The arrogance of the white coat had failed, leaving a vacuum of power that screamed for a leader. From the edge of the curtains, Zola watched the chief attending's disintegration without a shred of pity. She saw the fear, the incompetence, and the exact moment Sterling gave up on the patient to save himself. She adjusted her weight, her own hand suddenly and miraculously still. The engine was no longer idling. It was in gear. The rhythmic drone of the flatlining monitor was a death sentence, a singular, high-pitched note that vibrated in the marrow of Zola's bones. In that sound, the dormant machine of her past finally roared to life. The invisible nurse was gone. Zola moved. It wasn't a hurried, panicked scramble of the residents. It was a tactical breach. She crossed the room with a fluid, predatory grace that ignored the dark muzzles of the handguns still trained on the air. She reached the bedside in 3 strides, her presence so sudden and absolute that even the enforcers instinctively stepped back. Dr. Sterling was still frozen, his hands hovering uselessly over the tray, his eyes wide and glassy with shock. Without a word, Zola placed a hand on his shoulder. It wasn't a gentle nudge. It was a precise, forceful shove that sent the chief attending stumbling 3 feet away into the privacy curtains. He gasped, his Ivy League dignity tangling in the fabric as he collapsed into a heap of white linen. But Zola didn't even look at him. "Gloves," she commanded. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a resonant authority that sliced the panic like a scalpel. One of the younger nurses, acting on a reflex of pure survival, handed her a pair of latex gloves. Zola snapped them on, the sound sharp as a gunshot. Her left hand, the one Sterling had mocked for its nervous shakes, was now as steady as a mountain. The tremor had never been a defect. It had been an engine idling, and now the light was green. She looked at Han Tae-jaeun's chest. It was silent, one side bulging slightly, a tension pneumothorax. His lung was collapsing, the pressure of trapped air crushing his heart. Sterling had been looking for forceps. Zola was looking for a weapon. She grabbed a large-bore 14-gauge needle from the tray. "Hold him," she directed the 2 massive enforcers. They didn't hesitate. They saw the transformation in her eyes, the 1,000-yard stare of a soldier who had worked in the blood-slicked dirt of unauthorized clinics. They pinned the Mafia Boss's shoulders to the bed. Zola located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She didn't hesitate for a second. With a singular, brutal precision, she drove the needle deep into the chest wall. A sharp, violent hiss of trapped air escaped the needle, the sound of a life being reclaimed. It was the symphony returning to its rhythm. Instantly, the flatline drone on the monitor broke, replaced by the frantic but steady thump-thump of a heart finding its way back. Tae-jaeun's chest rose in a jagged, gasping breath. Zola didn't celebrate. She didn't look for approval. She maintained her grip on the needle, her eyes scanning the vitals with a cold, clinical detachment. Sterling watched from the floor, his face twisted in a mixture of humiliation and terror, realizing that the clumsy girl he had bullied was operating on a level of competence he would never achieve in 1,000 lifetimes. The air in the room had changed. The enforcers lowered their weapons, their eyes fixed on Zola with a new, wary respect. She had breached their perimeter, silenced their guns, and brought their king back from the threshold of the dark. The operative had switched on, and for the first time in years, Zola Nairi Whitman felt entirely at home. The hiss of escaping air was still fading when the tension in the room recalibrated into a different kind of danger. Han Tejun's breath was shallow but consistent, a fragile rhythm reclaimed from the brink. However, his enforcers remained a wall of dark suits and hair-trigger nerves. The lead bodyguard, a man with a jagged scar bisecting his eyebrow, stepped forward, his hand moving back toward the cold steel of his weapon. The language barrier was a secondary wound. Festering in the silence of the trauma bay, he barked a sharp, guttural command in Korean, his eyes darting toward the open door where hospital security was finally beginning to gather. Zola didn't look up from the monitors, but her entire posture shifted. She didn't flinch at the sound of his voice. She absorbed it, while Dr. Sterling remained a trembling heap against the wall and the residents hovered in a state of mute terror. Zola did something that stopped the hearts of everyone in the room. She spoke. The sounds that left her throat weren't the soft, conciliatory tones of a nurse trying to de-escalate a situation. It was a harsh, rhythmic, and impossibly precise regional dialect, the low, gravelly tongue of the northern provinces, a dialect used by the hardened wolves of the border cities. It was a language of shadows and iron, a tongue she had mastered in the unauthorized clinics where misplaced syllable could cost a life. "Put the steel away," she commanded in the dialect. Her voice was low, resonant, and carried the weight of a superior officer addressing a subordinate. "The king is breathing because I willed it. If you breach this perimeter, you bring the crows to his bed. Do you want him dead, or do you want him standing?" The lead enforcer froze. The shock on his face was so profound it surpassed the fear of the gunshot wound. He looked at Zola, a black woman in simple blue scrubs in the middle of a city hospital, and for a moment, his reality fractured. This wasn't the clumsy nurse the doctors had mocked. This was a woman who spoke the secret tongue of his homeland with the inflection of someone who had survived its most dangerous streets. "How? How do you know that speech?" The enforcer rasped, his voice dropping an octave as he lowered his hand from his holster. Zola finally turned her head, her gaze locking onto his with a cold, 1,000-yard stare that made the enforcer instinctively straighten his back. "I know the sound of a dying man in every language," she replied, still in the dialect. "Now, clear the line of sight and hold the door. If anyone wearing a badge or a white coat tries to enter before I've closed the wound, you handle it. Otherwise, stay out my light." The enforcer didn't argue. He didn't even blink. He gave a sharp, short nod of acknowledgement, turned his partner, and barked a command. The two massive men moved with sudden, disciplined efficiency, forming a physical barrier between the bed and the rest of the hospital. The room fell into a stunned, heavy silence. Dr. Sterling looked as though he had been struck, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the ghost he had spent months patronizing. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the shift in power. Zola Nairi Whitman had just asserted a dominance that had nothing to do with medical degrees or hospital hierarchy. She had spoken the language of the underworld, and the underworld had obeyed. The chaos in the trauma bay had been replaced by a heavy, pressurized silence, broken only by the steady, rhythmic chirping of the heart monitor. Under Zola's steady hands, the wounded king began to stir. Han Tejun's eyelids fluttered, his pupils dilating as they fought the glare of the overhead surgical lights. His first instinct was survival. His hand twitched on the sterile sheets, fingers curling as if searching for a weapon that was no longer there. But as his vision cleared, he didn't see the panicked face of Dr. Sterling or the trembling hands of a terrified resident. He saw Zola. She was leaning over him, her face a mask of absolute, disciplined calm. She was checking his peripheral pulse, her touch light but firm, her movements possessing a mechanical efficiency that bypassed the standard bedside manner of a civilian nurse. She didn't offer the platitudes of a healer. She stood over him with the watchful intensity of a sentry. Tae-Jaeun's gaze locked onto hers. He didn't look at her scrubs or the hospital ID clipped to her waist. He looked at her eyes, the 1,000-yard stare of someone who walked through fire and remained unburned. He felt the phantom pressure of the needle decompression she had performed, the sudden rush of air that had allowed him to reclaim his life. He heard the echoes of the northern dialect she had used to command his men, a tongue that spoke of shared battlefields and secret histories. Slowly, painfully, Han Tae-jeon began to move. His enforcer surged forward to assist him, but he raised a blood-stained hand, a sharp gesture that froze them in their tracks. Every muscle in his torso screamed in protest as he forced himself to sit more upright against the pillows. His white dress shirt was ruined, a crimson shroud of gangland war, but his dignity remained intact. He looked at Zola for a long, silent moment, a recognition between two predators in a room full of sheep. Then, with a slow and agonizingly deliberate motion, he raised his right hand to his temple. It wasn't a casual wave or a gesture of thanks. It was a formal military salute, crisp and unwavering despite the blood loss and the pain. It was the highest form of acknowledgement from a man of his stature, a declaration that he was not in the presence of subordinate, but a superior warrior who had successfully defended his life when all others had failed. Behind Zola, the air seemed to go out of the room. The three doctors stood frozen, their mouths agape, their earlier mockery turning into a cold, sinking weight in their stomachs. Dr. Sterling looked as though he had been struck, his face a pale mask of disbelief. He had spent months laughing at the new nurse, treating her like a clumsy ghost, only to watch the most dangerous man in the city pay her the ultimate tribute of respect. Zola didn't smile. She didn't nod. She stood with her shoulders squared, her hands relaxed at her sides, accepting the salute with the quiet grace of someone who had earned it 100 times over in lives they would never understand. The power shift was total. In the sterile light of Trauma Bay 1, the invisible nurse had been revealed as a legend, and the king had just confirmed it. The heavy silence following the salute was broken not by a medical alarm, but by the sharp, authoritative click of heels on the linoleum. Mrs. Halloway, the hospital's chief of administration, marched into the trauma bay with 2 security supervisors in tow. She was a woman who viewed the hospital as a balance sheet, and the sight of blood-soaked mobsters and a junior nurse standing in the center of a clinical violation was an affront to her order. She took one look at the scene. The displaced Dr. Sterling, the discarded medical equipment, and Zola standing defiantly at the bedside, and her face hardened into a mask of bureaucratic fury. She didn't look at the monitors or the fact that the patient was actually stable. Whitman, Halloway's voice snapped like a whip. Step away from that bed immediately. Dr. Sterling has already informed me of your intervention. You are a junior nurse, not a surgeon. You have violated every malpractice protocol in this city's charter. You are terminated, effective immediately. Security, escort her out and prepare a statement for the police. We are looking at criminal endangerment. Dr. Sterling, finding a second wind of arrogance now that the administration had arrived, straightened his lab coat. She pushed me, Mrs. Halloway. She physically assaulted a lead attending and performed an invasive procedure without a license. It's a miracle the patient is even alive. The security guards took a step toward Zola, their hands reaching for her arms. Zola didn't move. She didn't argue. She simply watched them with the cold, calculating stillness of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. But the strike didn't come from Zola. Don't touch her. The voice was a low, guttural rasp, but it carried a lethal weight that froze the security guards mid-stride. Han Tae-jeon had leaned forward, his eyes burning with a dark, terrifying clarity. The pain of his movements was visible, but it was eclipsed by a cold, radiating menace. You call her a nurse? Tae-jeon said, his gaze shifting to Halloway, then to Sterling. His voice was a serrated blade. This woman is the only reason your floors aren't covered in my blood and your own. Your lead attending froze like a frightened child while my lungs collapsed. If she had followed your protocols, I would be a corpse, and my men would have leveled this wing in retribution. Halloway stammered, her bureaucratic shield failing against the raw intensity of the man in the bed. Sir, we have rules. Your rules are for sheep, Tae-jeon interrupted, his hand tightening into a fist on the sheets. He looked at Zola, then back to the administrators. If you fire her, you close this hospital. If a single finger is laid on her, or her record shows anything but excellence for tonight, I will ensure that St. Jude's becomes a ghost story. She is under my protection. Do you understand?" The lead enforcer stepped forward, his hand resting conspicuously on his holster, reinforcing the ultimatum with a silent, ironclad stare. Holloway went pale, the realization dawning on her that she was no longer in a boardroom, but in a kingdom where the wounded king made the laws. She looked at Zola, really looked at her, and saw the 1,000-yard stare that Han Tae-jun had saluted. We can review the circumstances," Holloway whispered, her heels clicking as she took a defensive step back. Zola remained a statue, her face unreadable. She didn't need the mob boss to save her job, but she accepted the tactical advantage of his shield. The invisible nurse was gone, replaced by a woman who had just become the most protected person in the building. The standoff in the trauma bay was severed by a sound far more ominous than shouting, the heavy mechanical thud of the hospital's main power breakers being tripped. One by one, the fluorescent lights flickered and died, plunging St. Jude's Memorial into a suffocating, velvet darkness. The hum of the trauma center, the frequency Zola had been tracking all night, fell silent. A heartbeat later, the red emergency lights kicked in, bathing the sterile white corridors in a rhythmic, strobing crimson that looked like a heartbeat in a dying body. The hospital's backup generators groaned to life, but before they could stabilize the grid, the sound of muffled pops echoed from the lobby, the unmistakable, suppressed cough of high-end submachine guns. Zola's world snapped into high-definition clarity. While the administrators screamed and Dr. Sterling scrambled into the darkness of a supply closet, Zola's internal clock began to count. This wasn't a gangland scuffle. This was a surgical strike. The cleanup crew had arrived. "Get down," Zola commanded, her voice cutting to the panic like a physical weight. She didn't wait for Han Tae-jun's enforcers to respond. She grabbed the metal trauma bed and kicked the locking mechanism, sliding the Mafia Boss into the deep shadows of the alcove, where the structural pillars provided the most dense cover. Through the glass-walled bay, she saw them. They moved in a diamond formation, 3 shadows draped in tactical gray, wearing night vision optics that glowed like the eyes of predatory insects. They didn't move like street thugs. They moved like ghosts, professional mercenaries hired to ensure that Han Tae-jun never left his hospital alive. The lead enforcer, the one with the scarred eyebrow, drew his weapon, but Zola caught his wrist. "If you fire that now, you give them a muzzle flash to aim at," she hissed in the northern dialect. "They have thermal optics. You're a heat signature in a cold room. Follow my lead or die with your king." The enforcer hesitated, looking from the darkened hallway to the calm, lethal intensity in Zola's eyes. He saw the way she was already reaching for a canister of ethanol and a roll of surgical tape, her hands moving with a fluid, terrifying speed. She wasn't preparing a medical procedure. She was prepping a kill box. In the hallway, the professional hit squad reached the trauma bay's perimeter. They moved with a chilling, synchronized silence, their boots making no sound on the linoleum. They were less than 20 feet away. The air in the room grew cold, the smell of ozone from the failing electronics mixing with the impending scent of cordite. Zola crouched low, her rhythmic tremor completely gone, replaced by a stillness so absolute she seemed to disappear into shadows herself. The junior nurse was officially dead. The operative had taken the field. As the first mercenary's shadow elongated across the threshold of the trauma bay, Zola's fingers closed around a heavy-duty surgical scalpel. She didn't look at the weapon as a tool of healing. She looked at it as a way to open a path through the dark. The cleanup crew thought they were walking into a room full of panicked civilians and a dying man. They had no idea they were walking into the home turf of a magnificent monster. The first mercenary breached the threshold, his suppressed rifle sweeping the room in a professional, lethal arc. He expected a terrified nurse and a dying man. Instead, he found a ghost. Zola didn't wait for him to find his mark. She emerged from the shadow of the structural pillar not as a healer, but as a kinetic force. In one fluid motion, she jammed a heavy-duty surgical scalpel into the soft tissue beneath the mercenary's tactical helmet. It was a strike of anatomical precision, severing the brachial plexus before he could even register her presence. As he slumped, Zola caught his rifle, preventing it from clattering against the floor, and used his falling body as a shield against the second shadow entering the room. The air hissed. Zola had already loosened the valve on a nearby oxygen tank. As the second hitman raised his weapon, she kicked the tank over and triggered a manual defibrillator, not against the chest, but against the metal frame of the gurney positioned near the leaking gas. The resulting electrical arc ignited the localized oxygen pocket in a violent, controlled burst of white-hot pressure. The flash blinded the thermal optics of the remaining mercenaries, turning their high-tech advantage into a liability of white noise. The trauma bay became a dance of shadows and steel. Zola moved with the terrifying efficiency of a woman who viewed the human body as a series of pressure points and structural failures. She didn't use the rifle. She used the environment. When the third mercenary tried to recalibrate his night vision, Zola was already behind him. She utilized a length of high-tensile surgical wire, looping it with the practiced ease of a specialist. Han Tae-jun's enforcers watched from the dark, frozen in a state of awe and terror. They were professional killers, but what they were witnessing was different. This was the engine finally unleashed. Zola wasn't fighting. She was harvesting. She moved through the strobing red light like a wraith, her blue scrubs now dark with the spray of the cleanup crew. The final mercenary, realization dawning too late, tried to retreat into the hallway. Zola met him at the door. She gripped a heavy glass bottle of ethanol, shattering it against his visor to disorient him before driving a pair of surgical shears into the gap in his body armor. It was a clinical termination. Within 90 seconds, the trauma bay was silent again, save for the rhythmic, mechanical chirp of Tae-jun's monitor and a heavy, ragged breathing of the surviving mobsters. Zola stood in the center of the room, her shoulders squared, her face a mask of absolute, unshakable neutrality. The 4 professional assassins lay neutralized, 3 dead, 1 incapacitated, dismantled by a woman they had mistaken for an invisible junior nurse. Zola didn't check for praise. She didn't look at the blood on her hands. She simply walked back to the tray, picked up a fresh pair of gloves, and snapped them on. "The perimeter is clear," she said in the northern dialect, her voice as steady as a heartbeat. "Check the patient's vitals. We're not finished here yet." The emergency lights continued their rhythmic, crimson pulse, but the air in the trauma bay had finally begun to settle. The scent of cordite and ozone lingered, a grim testament to the 90 seconds of violence that had just transpired. Zola stood over Han Tae-jun's bed, her blue scrub stained with the lifeblood of the men she had just dismantled, her expression as unreadable as the redacted files that guarded her past. Dr. Sterling emerged from the supply closet, his white coat wrinkled and his face a map of absolute, wretched humiliation. He looked at the bodies of professional mercenaries, then at the surgical tools Zola had used as weapons, and finally at the woman he had spent months calling clumsy. He tried to speak, to reclaim some shred of his shattered authority, but the words died in his throat. He was a small man who had played at being a god, and tonight he had watched a real one go to work. Zola didn't offer him a glance. She turned her attention back to Han Tae-jun. The Mafia Boss was watching her with an intensity that bordered on reverence. The military salute he had given her earlier was no longer just a gesture of respect. It was a bond. He beckoned her closer, his breath hitched but steady. With a slow, deliberate motion, Tae-jun reached into the pocket of his ruined dress shirt. He pulled out a small, heavy object that caught the strobing red light. It wasn't paper or plastic. It was a business card made of matte black metal, cold and weighted. He pressed it into Zola's hand, his fingers lingering against her palm. "St. Jude's is a cage for a woman like you," he rasped, his eyes locking onto hers. "You are a wolf who has spent too long pretending to be a sheep. When you are tired of the silence, come find me. I have a war that needs a commander." Zola looked down at the black metal card. In the center, etched with laser precision, was a stylized coil of a black serpent. It was an invitation back to the world she had tried to leave behind, a world where her tremor was recognized as the idling engine of a weapon. A ghost of a smile, the first genuine emotion she had shown all night, touched her lips. "I charge extra for repeat customers," she said softly. She turned and walked toward the exit, moving past the arriving SWAT team and the shell-shocked hospital administrators as if she were just another traumatized staff member. In the locker room, she stripped off the blood-stained blue scrubs, revealing the black tactical undershirt she always wore beneath. She left the stethoscope on the bench, a relic of a civilian life that no longer fit. Zola stepped out of the hospital's side entrance and into the cool, biting night air. She didn't look back at the flashing sirens or the building where she had been invisible. She didn't look back at the life she had just burned to the ground. As she disappeared into the shadows of the city, her left hand was perfectly, terrifyingly still. The engine was no longer idling. The light was green and the hunt had begun.